Everyone who is decent hates bullies, and even if you're not personally involved, there's very little that's as satisfying as seeing a bully get what's coming to them. Now, who could be bigger bullies than people who were accosting women on the street at the turn of the 20th century? I'm going to share 3 or 4 amazing stories in this video of street harassers getting exactly what was coming to them. But first I got to recommend this book, Her Own Hero by Dr. Wendy Rouse. If you're interested at all in the history of what we now know as the women's self-defense movement, you're going to want to get this book. There's a ton of amazing stories about people using jiu-jitsu, people using boxing, people using other martial arts to defend themselves, and the roots of that happening in America and growing into what we now know as women's self-defense. In subsequent videos, we'll be talking about how women use jiu-jitsu as tools against family violence, domestic violence, and even as a tool to help win the right to vote. But today, we're talking about mashers. A masher was the term people used for street harassment during the time. And between 1900 and about 1910, there were tons of these guys that were harassing women. Fortunately for the women, jiu-jitsu was a fad for everyone, but particularly for women in America. From Washington, D.C., which is where this article comes from, to Fargo, North Dakota, to the Pacific Northwest, to the American South, to California, to all points in between, people were learning martial arts, including jiu-jitsu, and women were using it to defend themselves. Upper-class women had access to high-quality instructors. Other folks had women's clubs where they would have demonstrations. And as Dr. Rouse talks in her book, a lot of times folks would organize themselves into self-defense clubs for working-class women as well. In San Francisco, they even got it into public schools, and that's where our first case comes from. A young Californian woman named Estelle Wyman was on a visit to New York City when she was accosted on the street. Fortunately, she'd taken some classes in jiu-jitsu at the local public high school, and when the guy kept after her, she threw him to the ground. This incident was reported in newspapers all across the country, from the San Francisco Daily Call in December 1904 and from the Honolulu Star-Advertiser the next month in January 1905. What's even cooler is in some of the narrative reports from newspapers at the time, after she throws him and he gets up all covered in mud, he starts to scuttle away, and some of the other guys that are watching say, "Hey, should we go grab him and have him arrested?" And she says, "Oh no, I think he's had enough." It's kind of like a movie, isn't it? He walks by her 2 or 3 times, ogling and hassling her. When he finally comes up and grabs a hold of her, she throws him, and then he scuttles off as she says, "Oh yeah, he's had enough." It's kind of like a movie. I mean, what's more gangster than saying, "I guess he's been punished enough," and talking about how you learned some of this in high school? The next one is even more cinematic, and believe it or not, we're not even going to get to the best part of the story in this video. We're going to have to do that in a follow-up. In the business, we call that a tease. Nevertheless, this was reported in dozens of newspapers in a lot of different ways, and the accounts are remarkably consistent. A young woman named Misao Sogo who was walking down the street. She's tiny, she weighs about 110 pounds, and a guy starts to harass her. She hits what looks to be a foot sweep on him, and he goes down. Passersby stop to stare. He gets up. She asks, "Have you had enough?" The guy says no and starts to come at her again. Yeah, bad idea. Always say you've had enough. She hits him with an even bigger throw this time. Cops come by, including a famous cop we'll talk about more in the next video, and the guy gets arrested. How do we know so much about this case? Unlike a lot of things at the time, this actually went to court, and it was reported on in numerous newspapers. This next bit is the second best part of the story for my money. Like many Japanese immigrants at the time, her English was not super great. So when the judge asks, "Hey, what did you do to this guy?" she's unable to explain it in a way that he can actually understand. Then somebody says, "Hey, why don't you show the judge?" And that right there is how we know that she had a big throw on him. That guy who agreed to be thrown was her interpreter, who volunteered to serve as uke in the courtroom and got thrown not once but twice. 2 fun details about this. First of all, the defendant actually said, "Hey, she got a lot more air when she threw me," apparently kind of confessing or at least adding a little spice to it. And second, who was it that suggested that this throw happen? Sorry, but you have to come back for the second part of this video, because that's, I think, the coolest part of the story. Yeah, just in case you thought I was kidding about the defendant saying, "She threw me even higher than that." That's from the Water Valley Progress, a Mississippi newspaper, on December 2nd, 1905. 2 other fun elements of this story. This guy, J.F. McCullum, who accosted the young woman, turned out to be a sparring partner of the professional boxer Terry McGovern. Terry McGovern won the World Bantamweight Championship and the World Featherweight Championship. This just made it more impressive, and reporters ran with the story, "The girl who whipped a prize fighter." Second detail is how small Misao Sogo was. In some reports, she's as little as 90 pounds. In this, she's as big as 110 pounds. Either way, she was about half the size of her assailant. You also see this show up in the Estelle Wyman story, and you can see how people would use that to market jiu-jitsu as an art where people who are smaller and less physically dominant can defend themselves, even against professional athletes. There were many cases like this, but I want to talk about a third from that year, from November 1st, when a woman named Emolio Martin grabbed a guy by the lapel, secured a sleeve grip, and did a twisting throw that I like to imagine was Morote Seonage. All these cases had a lot in common, but I want to pull out two things we haven't talked about yet. The first, the emphasis on their size. These women were portrayed as tiny, even childlike in some cases. And in each case, their small size was juxtaposed due to the huge size of their attacker. And sometimes these things would be exaggerated, but there's no reason to believe that it wasn't accurate when the news reported things like Miss Emilio Martin was 5'4", 110 pounds, and the man who insulted her was 6 feet in height and weighed 180 pounds. By the way, Emilio Martin, much like Misao Soga, had to throw her assailant twice before he gave up. The second thing all these cases had in common is they ended up in newspaper columns and editorials as reasons that all American women should learn jiu-jitsu. Nicola Greeley-Smith, who was really important in this whole story and someone we'll do a whole video about, wrote a column called Jiu-Jitsu for the Masher, where she advocated subsidized public education that would provide jiu-jitsu education to young women to protect them from street harassment. The other thing all three of these cases had in common is that they inspired many newspaper columns and editorials, including this one by the very important Nicola Greeley-Smith. We'll have a whole video about her as well. In this article, Jiu-Jitsu for the Masher, she advocated subsidizing public education so that all women would have the chance to learn jiu-jitsu to protect themselves. We'll say more about her in subsequent videos, but she was super interesting not only because of her consistent advocacy for self-defense training, but she was also a suffragist, and if you ever heard the phrase, "Go West, young man," by Horace Greeley, yeah, that's her grandfather. It's probably not a surprise that these stories made it into so many American newspapers in the early 1900s. Everybody loves an underdog story, everybody hates a bully, and if you can get an illustration of a tiny woman throwing a man twice her size to the ground into the paper, you know that that's going to lead. I reviewed more than 2,500 articles from this period though, and I'll tell you the one thing that did surprise me. The portrayal of women doing jiu-jitsu during this period was almost uniformly positive. There was, of course, some sexist stuff and a lot of exceptions, and we'll get into that. But it wasn't just the Nicola Greeley-Smiths that approved of women doing jiu-jitsu. It was male journalists, it was female journalists, it was column writers, opinion writers, editorial writers. It was community members who were quoted in stories. And in this case, from the Omaha Bee, it was the judge in the Misao Soga trial who said, "I wish our American girls knew jiu-jitsu like that. They wouldn't be bothered by mashers," before sentencing the defendant to disorderly conduct and fining him $5. In fact, one of the main worries appears to have been that women would stop doing jiu-jitsu. In the Montgomery Advertiser here in 1906, the journalist Mary Gold Lytle worries that unfortunately it will be merely a fad with American women and they will stop learning jiu-jitsu to defend themselves. Insert joke about women earning blue belts in 1906 here. There's a ton more that I'm excited to talk about here. Women defending themselves from domestic violence using jiu-jitsu during this period. Women using jiu-jitsu to help fight for the right to vote both here in America and in the United Kingdom. And of course, the way gender has been portrayed in jiu-jitsu over the last century and a quarter and whatnot. And yes, I haven't forgotten. I still owe y'all what I think is the best detail about this event, which I will pay off in a video that I'll post tomorrow. But for now, in these times of division, I think we can all agree having a dude get thrown on his face twice in the middle of a courtroom just to show how a tiny Japanese lady beat up a professional boxer, it's pretty objectively awesome.